Today is April 14th of 2014, and we are doing an oral history interview with Laurie Ann Guerrero. Can you state your full name, date, and place of birth, please?
I'm Laurie Ann Guerrero. I was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas.
Great. Yeah, so Laurie Ann Guerrero is the author of A Tongue in the Mouth of the Dying, which is the prize-winning book for the last edition of the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize. Let's start with a little bit of your childhood. Just tell us a little bit where you come from, where's home.
I grew up south San Antonio. My family, my grandfather bought a piece of land that was part of the Dionisio Martinez land grant of 1834. And the street there is Martinez Lozoya, and our family is Martinez Guerrero. So I grew up on this land. It wasn't a lot, maybe 10 acres. And my grandfather lived in one house, and we lived in another house. And between the two houses were our garden, this little piece of. So I grew up out there, and which was about 4 miles, maybe 5 miles outside of town. But we went to school in town my mother worked in town at our schools, and but I grew up in the country. I grew up barefoot and in the cactus. And
can you talk a little bit about this land grant, what it was, and sort of like your family's diverse roots and the history of how far your roots are to the city of San Antonio?
Well, it gets complicated because there's not a lot of documentation, right? So, it's kind of the history is kind of in bits and pieces, but I know that our family, my grandfather's family, they were all from a small town called Thelma, Texas, which is we lived, like I said, about 5 miles from town, and Thelma is about 5 miles south from where I grew up, so it's really not far at all. And so, there's the, I'm really not sure how my grandfather had a 3rd grade education, right? So the way he inherited this history was through just the talk of the adults and stuff. So by the time it got to me, it's sort of broken, and I remember my grandfather saying all the time that this land was our land, and it has always belonged to us. He said, and they took it away from us and then parceled it back out, right, in the land grants. But he was adamant about having the land of our family back in his name, in our name.
And you heard these stories
growing up.
Do you think these stories, do you consider them as sort of your earliest exposures to poetry, or? Well,
for sure. I mean, I think that because things were changing so fast in my life, and things were always changing. So, my parents I grew up on this land. My parents got divorced when I was 16, and it was kind of a rocky marriage that they had. And so I needed to connect to something, and I was always very connected to my grandfather. But because I grew up in this land, that I grew up knowing, like, inherently, this is my land, while things were changing and we were getting older, and my dad was moving away, or whatever it was, things that were happening, the land never changed, right? And this environment never changed, and that's my home, and things could be very different. So there was that, but also, like, in this space between the two houses, that was the space where my grandfather and I had our this community that we had just between me and him, and so, whether it was picking the tomatoes or whatever it was, weeding out whatever it was we were doing, my grandfather would tell stories, and I remember being when I first came into poetry, reading poems, and just being fascinated with the kind of efficiency, in poetry, recognizing my grandfather's voice in this, because these were the stories that he was telling while we were, whatever it was we were doing, picking tomatoes, I say, because usually we were picking tomatoes, and it was summertime. when I would think about my grandfather and the stories he would tell, and these are stories that I heard my whole life, you know, I realized that it was the telling, retelling, and retelling, and retelling, that he was actually, that it was revision, right? So he was, to me, the ultimate poet, where he had no ability to, he didn't learn to write till he was an adult, third grade education, but in this oral storytelling, you know, the turn of a phrase or it was beautiful to hear him. And because I sort of grew up with this in my ear, when I started to read poetry on the page, it was like, I got it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. You were recently named Poet Laureate of San Antonio. And earlier today you were sharing a story of how in 6th grade you won a poetry contest. So I was just wondering, I know it's a long frame of time, but you know, how does this little girl who wins a poetry contest get to be the Poet Laureate of San Antonio?
That's a good question.
Also because from there you didn't have you had a different sort of you had kids, you know, before you did your undergrad, and you were married and had children when you did your MFA. So it's incredible to realize this little girl wins a prize, and she's gonna be the Poet Laureate of San Antonio.
No pressure, Lauro. It's funny because, I mean, it's new, right? The whole being Poet Laureate for my city that I love. It's new, so I think I'm still sort of grappling with that too, and like, how does that happen? But so I won this contest, and when I was in the 6th grade, I was 11 years old, and I won it was my school district, the Harlandale Cultural Arts Festival, and I won first place. And that was the first time ever that I was being acknowledged for writing, and people were listening, right? I mean, literally listening, because I had to get up and read my poem at this festival. And I remember feeling just so empowered, because as the only girl in my family, and being a Chicana in the different spaces and I was only 11, but I had already experienced, plenty of racism and sexism. So to be in that space, and I just felt super empowered, and I thought, if I write, I remember consciously thinking, writing makes people listen. And so I knew I wasn't going to stop writing. I knew I just needed to keep writing. I didn't know what, and I didn't know how, but I knew I was going to keep writing. And I think because of that first sense of empowerment, it helped me sort of go through my life where whatever it was I'm doing, getting married, having babies, I needed to be able to be heard, which is not to say that I always had something to say, right? But the fact that I could have a space to speak was really important.
It was an elementary school teacher who submitted your poem?
No, that was a different story. That was
okay.
in high school when they submitted my work. No, this was everybody in the school was like submitting to this, district wide.
And you mentioned too that since you were 14, you knew you wanted to go to Smith College, and you were 26 or 27. I
was 27 when I went.
When you first went.
That's crazy, right?
Yeah. Why Smith College? What drew you to go there? I guess it's also
not a great, like, the answer's not great. Like, honestly, I was 14, and when I wrote an essay and my teacher submitted it to the paper, and that was like that surprise. But that same teacher was giving us poems in class, and I want to say that she gave me Sylvia Plath separately. Like, I don't think the whole class got it. I think I just got it. I don't know for sure. I don't remember. It felt that way anyway. And so when I read Sylvia Plath, there was something in her language and like I said, I was so fascinated with being empowered by writing that when I read Sylvia Plath, I thought, that's super. Like, well, how do you say these kind of things and it be okay as a woman, right? so I was so fascinated with her, I started reading as much as we didn't have internet back then. So I was like reading books about her life. And when I discovered that she had gone to Smith, and again, I had no clue what Smith was. I had no idea the prestige. I had no idea the super famous women who had gone there before. All I knew was that if I wanted to write like that, and so I was going to do whatever she did so that I could write that way. She went to Smith, so that's where I was going to start. I wanted to go to Smith. Of course, I got married 4 years later, you know, when I was 18. And had my son a year later, and then I had my daughter. And I mean, I really had thought for a while that dream was out the window. But it wasn't, and I just needed to call it back up again, you know.
So you mentioned your grandfather and these stories, this sort of oral influence, and then Sylvia Plath, that's sort of the first, you know, literary or, you know, Britain poet that maybe it's not the first. I'm assuming it was one of your first.
Poet, yeah.
So that was your entryway into books, or did you?
Yeah. Well, like it probably wasn't the first. That was the first time that I was like, you know. Yeah, I think the first was I read House on Mango Street when I was 11. And it was at the same time that I had won this contest when I was 11. I was reading that book, and I remember like holding the book in my hand and flipping it over and seeing that Sandra Cisneros lives in San Antonio. And that was empowering for me, because then I thought, well, you can live in San Antonio and be a writer. That's not impossible, right? So that gave me a little bit of room, right? It kind of opened up a path for me. So I was reading her, but I was also reading, like, I had eventually made my way to the library and got a book of Emily Dickinson and Maya Angelou. And so it was like Maya Angelou, Emily Dickinson, Sandra Cisneros, and Sylvia Plath. Those were my four. I mean, and I had their words written on my wall and printed, you know, their poems on my. I mean, those were my four main, yeah.
And then when you got to Smith, what were you exposed to there? What was that experience like?
That was, well, I think because I was so, I think in awe of Smith when I got there, because, you know, here was the first time where I was surrounded by these women who were just super strong and super empowered and super unapologetic, which was new to me, because any strong woman that I knew in San Antonio or in my world, they were apologetic, you know, for being, you know, open or having opinions, right? It was always like, sorry, but. So I read a lot of, I couldn't even, there were so many, but I was also very interested in like women's studies, gender studies, and those were the classes, I think. While I loved the Poetry Center and I did a lot of work and a lot of reading with poetry, I was so consumed with naming, for me, all the things, naming the different things in my life, like sexism and racism and intersectionality, and just being able to sort my life out. And then it was almost, I hate to say that, but it was almost like on the side I went back to my love. Like that was my happy place, but the work I was doing was in these other kind of issues.
What is the Poetry Center at Smith? I saw that they have a website and some of your poems are on there.
Right, yeah. So the Poetry Center at Smith is great. It's it's an institution basically, and they just bring in poets from all over the place, all over the world, and as a student there, we have this access to these great writers, and every time there's a writer comes through, you know, as the poetry students, or you know, we get to have this one-on-one conversations with them, or Q&As and whatnot, and that was amazing for me because of that, I got to have these one-on-one conversations with, you know, Sharon Olds and Adrienne Rich. That was huge for me, Adrienne Rich. We spent the whole afternoon together one day. You know, and if I hadn't been at Smith, I wouldn't have had that, and I wouldn't have, and you know, all of these, and we were talking about destiny earlier. You know, I was supposed to have these conversations with these really life-changing influences, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
What was your time at Drew like you did your MFA, right?
It was nice. No, Drew was interesting. Drew was it was interesting. I'm very, very grateful for my experience at Drew, because it brought me to poets and friends. They're now my friends, like Araceli Girmay, Patrick Rosal, Vazquez. Those three people for me are like lifesavers, like literally lifesavers for me. But I had an interesting experience at Drew when I got there, and it was a very segregated space for me, and just me individually. I don't know that anybody else had that experience, but like I said, it was a very important part of my journey to be in a space like that and have to fight my way through it.
Do any of the poems that you wrote, well...
You just want me to talk about it, right?
No. Well, like, I want to move on to talking about the poems.
Okay.
So, do any of the poems that you wrote at Drew make their way to your collection?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah?
So Colonization of the Poetic, the 9-piece poem, is about my experience at Drew, and the one incident that happened to me while I was an undergrad.
Why don't you read a section of it, and then you can talk about the...
Okay. Is there a section you want me to read?
I'll let you choose it.
Oh, okay.
Maybe the very first one.
Oh, okay.
And
I never read that one, but okay, I will. Should I read the epigraph too?
If you want, yeah.
One man's name, colonization of the poetic. Bridges are thresholds to other realities, archetypal primal symbols of shifting consciousness. They span liminal spaces between worlds, spaces I call Nepantla, a Nahuatl word meaning tierra entre medio, land in between. Laurie Ann Guerrero. This is the womb. There are the men from which my children came, those white beards. This is the skin I use to feel these feet wave like flags in the sky above us. Walk the land. With these hands I straighten the spines of my children. On this bridge they were given to live. There are the men who line up ships. So...
I mean, you can mention where the genesis of the poem comes from, but I'm also interested in what it's a section. It's in sections and it's distributed throughout the collection. What were some of your aesthetic decisions for distributing the poem in that way?
Well, because when this incident happened to me, I couldn't help but and we're talking about this too, right? When something happens or when how we react to certain things, my first instinct is to sort of go backwards and trace backwards as to why am I reacting this way? Why would this person say something like this to me? I want to make sense of it. I need to make sense of it so that I'm not angry, right? Because I don't want to live angry. So in doing that, I thought about, like, here is a white man saying something to me, and when we trace back that history, right, it goes back to the colonization and all, and here we were all these hundreds of years later, and this is still this sort of destroying of me as a woman and my culture and my family, and with just words, but such painful, ugly words. So in that process, after coming home, because it was a low residency, right? So after coming home and sort of deconstructing this and feeling this anger and not wanting to have this anger and needing to write, I was sort of just documenting what was coming up, and so when I sat down to write this poem, I had journaled enough about it that I knew it wasn't going to be angry on the page. I didn't want the poem to sound angry. I didn't want to confirm that stereotype, right, of the angry Latina. That was very important to me. I didn't want to buy into that. So the poem came, the 9 pieces came like in one sitting, but I knew that you need space in between them, I think. And actually Patrick Rosal was one of my final readers when I finished the manuscript, and and he suggested, because I had it in the middle of the book, because for me it was the backbone of the book, but he suggested, he said, why don't you break it up, and the pieces were different, like the sections were different, and so when he suggested, I thought, well, I'll think about it, but then I thought it was a good idea because the way that these revelations came to me were like here, and then here, and then here, and during my dealing with this, I was living my life. I was raising my kids and going to work, and and then when I'm on the page working, that's when these revelations were coming. So I thought that went well. That fit, I think, the book.
Yeah, I want to make an observation, and maybe you can choose to comment on it or not, and then have other questions if you don't want to add anything. One man's name, colonization of the poetic, it alludes, like you said, going back to the history, it alludes to the conquest and to Cortez and La Malinche, this woman who is kind of seen as a traitor by in Mexican history at least, and who is a woman, and so La Malinche, she was born, I believe, in the Aztec Empire, and was given away, either as as a prize, or just because she was a woman. She was given away to I believe a Mayan tribe, and so she spoke Nahuatl and Mayan. When Cortez got to Mexico, he went to the Yucatan, where a group of Spanish had been cast away. A man by Guerrero, and then I think Jimenez was the other one. Guerrero chose, this is like a side story, but Guerrero married a Mayan woman and chose to remain in the Yucatan, and he actually died fighting the Spanish. But Jimenez went with Cortez, and in many ways, so they trekked to the Aztec capital and conquered, and Jimenez spoke Spanish and Mayan, and La Malinche spoke Nahuatl and Mayan. So in the translation from Mayan to Spanish, La Malinche was sort of the one with power, in the conquest, and like the title is a tongue in the mouth of the dying, and it's about speaking, is about tongues, recording. It's kind of, I'm just making these broad generalizations, but there's no real question, I guess, behind it.
Yeah, it was right. So thinking back to all of those things, and sort of having learned that history, not till I was at Smith, and not because it was part of my work. It was something I was doing on the side, right? But yeah, so it's interesting because, Cortez has always been an interesting thing to me because my family is Cortez. That's my mother's family's name is Cortez, and I keep my grandfather's name, Guerrero. So like playing with the idea of these Cortezes, and because my family comes up, my mother's family comes up in those poems too, and we were sort of raised from my mother's side like, oh, we have Spanish blood, we're Cortez, like this was something to celebrate, and so I was raised that way. And actually, my full name, like my legal name, is Laurie Ann Guerrero. Like that's my full name, and so I could carry all of these names, right?
Yeah.
Is heavy. It's heavy. It's heavy to carry all. That's probably why I don't carry them all. But I think the idea of La Malinche moving in these different circles, right? And so to be me, going to school, like going to Smith and then going to Drew, like when I got accepted to Smith, my family said that I thought I was, you think you're white now, you're white now, there was this whole this feeling of betrayal. I'm betraying my people because I'm getting educated. I was being outcast because of it. People were looking at me differently, expecting me to be different. So like all of that, right? All of that experience, and then how similar, right? How are we living all of these years, and we're still doing, like, it's still the same. It's still, we're still, yeah. And you know, and so like in those poems, it's really just documentation of, it's just a recording of this history, you know? It's not out to it's just a recording of this history, right? What women are still having to deal with.
I have to look at my notes real quickly.
Okay.
But, so I wrote a little, when I was reading through your collection, I on the margins I wrote, "The tongue is your emblem, both the absence of tongues and the wielding of them." Maybe I was wondering if you can read sort of the opening poem, "Preparing the Tongue," and talk about the significance of the title and of title, how you came to title this collection.
Okay, yeah. Preparing the tongue. In my hands, it's cold and knowing as bone. Shrouded in plastic, I unwind its gauze mummy-like, rub my wrist blue against the cactus of its buds. Were it still cradled inside the clammy cow mouth, I should want to enchant it. Let it taste the oil in my skin, lick the lash of my eye. What I do instead is lacerate the frozen muscle, tear the brick-thick cud conductor in half to fit a ceramic red pot. Its cry reaches me from some heap of butchered heads as I hack away like an axe murderer. I choke down the stink of its heated moo, make carnage of my own mouth, add garlic. So this poem, you know, this poem, I actually wrote it when I was making a lengua. I really was cooking a lengua. But in the process of writing it, or I should say in the process of revising it, I realized just how representative of Are the Many Tongues, right, that it was. And so you know, this poem, I moved it to the front of the book because it was so, it has everything in it. It has sex, it has violence, it has everything, right, that I explore in the book, and specifically what women represent, right? So, you know, it's sort of a bad thing that women can be, or so, you know, I mean, I was raised that it was like this bad thing that women are outspoken, that they have an opinion, or that they do, you know. But also, like, the fact that it's a meal, and that you're preparing a meal, and this is what we're feeding our children, right? This is you're making this meal, and this is what I'm going to serve my family with, right? And so they're you know, commenting on the idea that these histories that we have, and how we perpetuate them, right? And how this is why we're still living that same history, because we keep feeding it to our children. We keep doing this. We keep, right? So that was part of
a similar poem as this one is the ode to the, I think it's called Ode to the Little Mexican Pot, or the
Little Mexican Pot.
Little Mexican Pot. Which is I call it a ode. Do you see it as a
yeah,
ode?
I could see that. I never have, but yeah, I could see that.
Yeah,
Sure.
so and it's similar in that there's food, there's stories, there's cooking, and there's that last line about the pot never being completely shut.
Yeah. The wide red mouth.
Could you read it?
Yeah, sure.
And talk about the last line.
Okay.
In particular, and then talking about not wanting to be seen as angry, but I think there's that last line is like it's a burst of anger. But a celebratory anger.
Sure. Yeah. Little Mexican Pot. Filled to a sandpapery edge with bubbling love potion, good beer, cilantro, fatty slab bacon, sweet little beans spotted and brown as a newborn goat. The stink of you can get a man going. Make him weaken, womble, meaty arms steady plateside before he reaches for the first buttery bite. Formed from the dry Mexican dirt, hand-painted and hardened in fire, round sides, creased lip, holes notched for fingers and dish rags, a wide red mouth that doesn't shut completely. Yeah, so so this poem, yeah, I mean, I think of the, these pots, right, that we get from Mexico that we make our beans in and stuff, and it was interesting to me because, like, I mean, I come to these poems, like, literally, like, the last two, anyway, from the actual act of doing these things, right? So even this one, I was, like, making beans, and, like, I was living in Massachusetts at the time. My father had brought me one of these jarros, right? Jarros? Is that what they're called? Yeah, jarros, yeah. So, but I remember thinking, like, here I was in Massachusetts, like, writing my book, working on this, and just becoming very empowered, and then having this pot that was so representative of all the women in my family. And then thinking, too, that how could I come from these women and be who I am, unapologetically be who I am, if they didn't first have that sense of, like that sense of need, right, or desire to speak. And I think about, like, how the women in my family, I mean, this is kind of common knowledge now, but, like, how the women in the family sort of run things, and how they're the ones who keep things settled and build up the household, right, so that the men can do what they have to do. And thinking back about to the times when hearing my mother speak up for herself, or hearing my grandmother speak up for herself, or hearing, right, and so that was, I had become this pot, like I then was embodying all these little bits of these women, right? Here I was the whole thing. That's how it felt, anyway. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So there's the, like I said, the wielding of tongues, of speaking up. But interestingly enough, I also get the absence of tongues. I want to read something that you wrote in an interview that you did online.
Okay.
I began to see the poems I was began to see that the poems I was writing were linked to different kinds of silences. Eventually, I began connecting the dots between modern-day domestic sexual verbal abuse and infanticide, homicide, suicide, with the tragic and brutal history of the U.S. There was a trickling down of oppressions that moved from the public spaces, cotton fields, vegetable fields, factories, to the very private spaces, the bedroom, the kitchen, and you also write in the same interview, from which I plugged the passage of the violence of illiteracy, and you have the poem Sunday after breakfast, the lesson in speech, which is in a way a lesson on out surviving violence by biting one's tongue, if you will, and so I wanted to see if you could talk about this out surviving violence by keeping quiet and rebelling in a different sort of way, and in relationship to the epigraph by Pablo Neruda, which opens the collection. I guess the violence of illiteracy and anonymity and being quiet.
Right. So I think, well, first, thank you for that, because I think that's really important, and I don't get to talk about that often. And I think that was part of that personal history, personal research that I was doing, like in my own family, these silences, because, and mainly because, and this is kind of sounds ridiculous, but like just because, I'm Guerrero, and I was raised to be Guerrero, right? To live up to my name, to be a warrior, and but I wasn't really. The boys were raised that way. And as the only girl in the family, I was kind of on the outskirts, kind of watching how the boys were expected to be a certain way. But because I wanted to fit in that space, because I wanted to be acknowledged, I was going to do what they're doing, and I was going to do it better, right? So since I was a little girl, like that's always been my thing, which is ridiculous, I think, but not totally. But so having that kind of experience as a little girl, sort of trying to get in, and recognizing too that, oh, this is what it's like to be female, not having a say, not, and seeing these kind of violences, in the house I grew up in. And so, yeah, so like, when I see, knowing that this is in my history, in the history of the women in my family, and the men in our family, this is our history. This is the personal history that we have, but it's also a very cultural, and it's a very, it is an American history, right? Too. So, when I think about how, when I made this realization, when I had the realization that this kind of stuff was happening in households, not just in my household, but in the house next door, and the house next door, and trying to really understand why. Why does it happen? What is, like, so this is what we were talking about earlier, right? Like, so how do you trace that back to find out what happened to certain people or certain peoples that this has come into the present, where people are doing horrible things still. So that kind of silence and that kind of racism that was happening in the cotton fields or whatever fields before the cotton fields, so racism happening to my grandfather on the cotton field may or may not have directly affected how he was treating my grandmother, and I don't know their history. They got divorced before I was born, but how my father was raised, and so how my father was dealing with his wife or wives, because he's had two, right? And so seeing my personal history, and then taking that and looking in the newspapers, like what was happening in my city. So infanticide, murder, suicides, homicide, like all these kinds of ways where these people are sort of just carrying this inherited sense of less than, right? So that it's erupting toward the people we love most, or that we say we love most, our children, our wives, our husbands, our parents. That realization was kind of shocking to me, and good at the same time, because I was like, oh, maybe I got it. Is like, if this is why we're doing it, then I think if we just knew, if we could just acknowledge that all of this that we're carrying is inherited, and we can just not take it and start brand new, then, I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but like if we could just do that, if we could just like put it on the table, like just put everything on the table, and let's look at it, let's own what we're gonna own, and we can throw the rest out. We don't have to carry that anymore. I mean, we can't do that though, right? Mm-hmm. It's in us. It's in our blood. And so as a mother, doing this research and really thinking through all of these things, I can't help but think of my own children and thinking, like, where is that line? Where is that line as a mother that I don't cross, that I don't hurt my children the way, I was hurt, or my parents were hurt, or my grandparents were hurt? How do we keep that separate? How do we move forward with the good and not with the bad? And so, I mean, those are kind of things that I'm all over the place. Am I all over the place?
No.
I feel like I'm all over the place.
Can you read the poem? Something else that I wanted to talk about, regarding your work is it's sort of a different topic but related. But I was wondering if you could read the poem "Stray Cat" first before I ask you to comment on it.
Okay. I've been reading that one a lot lately. Where is it? Here it is. Stray cat. She was fat, round as the moon and just as gray. She didn't have time for hiding, for safety, for hissing away onlookers. Her legs jerked and out rolled the little slick and wormy bundles. Two. She circled them, inspected the mousy ears, licked the furless pink skin. They made no noise. Their tiny hearts rippled, though softly. She ate one, then she ate the other.
I was wondering if you could talk about that poem. One thing that I haven't seen talk much about, regarding your poems is what, for lack of a better words, I call this sort of dark underbelly towards the end of the book. A lot of the poems, deal with infanticide, right, towards the end, and then it complicates, or sort of mainstream understanding of femininity, what it means to be a mother, and particularly in terms of behavior, I think. Yeah, like what, how do you, yeah, like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So I think right. So I mean, I can't help but wonder about these things, right? Because I'm a mother, and the more that things were happening, like literally closer and closer to my house, then that's when that line became sort of visible. Like there's a line here that, I mean, we're the same. Like Maria from down the street, we're the same, and her husband murdered her and killed her. Killed her and killed her son and her unborn child, and so the reality of all of these things, that they were getting closer and closer to home. I went backwards, and the stray cat, that story is a true story, and I remembered it. I mean, I've always kind of known about it. I mean, I always remembered it, but I started making the connection between the natural, like the natural, the instinct of this mother cat to eat her babies, and wondering now as an adult, as a mother, what was that about, right? They were early. They didn't have fur. They weren't, they were early, and she ate them, and I was thinking about, the folklore, like La Llorona, and how I've heard, we've all heard different stories of why she killed the children. Like, was it, her husband or her lover was with someone else, and so she did it out of revenge. And then the story that I side with is that maybe because I can I can understand the growing up living in poverty and being poor, and that need to take her children out of that. So, when I think about this stray cat, it reminded me of that story of La Llorona, the merciful Llorona, who was taking her children out of this life that they were not going to survive, and Stray Cat, is a sister poem to Turnips, because it was growing these vegetables that I loved, that I just loved, and we played with the vegetables. They were big, and then we had to eat them. So loving something so much, and then, out of survival, having to consume it. That was hard to swallow, no pun intended. But that was like a hard thing to really, to get, So I don't know. I mean, I don't have answers. I don't know.
Can you read that poem, Turnips?
Which one, Turnips?
Yeah.
Turnips. We pulled them up, dug them out to let their white purple skin see the sun. We dusted their tops and their bottoms like proud parents, our fingernails black with worm guts and hard gray dirt. On a cool dusk years ago, my brother and I planted them in one round row in the front yard where they could be seen. The small, smooth seeds were dark and jumpy in Mama's hand like chocolate sprinkles on a cake. We giggled as we took 2 or 3 at a time and lulled them into the belly of their earth mommy. They grew quick, overnight. I swear their limey green arms welcomed us home from school the very next day. Then Mama cut them, souped them, and we ate.
Right. Would you like to add anything else? Anything that you would like to say and that I didn't bring up?
No, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I am, and I'm just thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.